LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture Series, John Ralston Saul.
Welcome back. I want to start by thanking the drum. That's the way it's said. This was a formal welcome song to all of us offered by the Red Spirit Singers. This drumming has a formal spiritual meaning. In Ojibwe, it's known as the heartbeat of the earth. And thank you to Chief Stacey LaForme of the Mississauga of the Credit. You welcomed 50 new citizens at the citizenship ceremony this morning, the first event of 6 Degrees. You do us great honor by your presence tonight, as we are on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently, your territory, that of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory, which is a really fabulous thing because it's both a treaty, but it's also a meaning of inclusion and egalitarianism. We're all eating from the same dish, in the same dish, with the same spoon. It's a symbol of egalitarianism right from the very beginning. And that treaty of the dish with one spoon bound those nations, those indigenous nations, to share the territory and protect the land. And so all of us, indigenous nations, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. It's wonderful to have the Lieutenant Governor with us again. Been with us each year, Your Honor, and it's a fantastic thing. And it's so important to have a Lieutenant Governor who is an intellectual and who engages in so many of the important ideas that are put forward in Toronto. And we're just always so pleased to see you. Thank you. And I'd also like to recognize two of the founders of the LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture. We founded it in 1999, and the first lecture was in 2000. Laura Baldwin, who's sitting next to the chief, who was married to Larry Baldwin, one of the descendants. It's a very large family, the Baldwins, but Laura and Larry have been, he's dead now, but have been great activists over the years, and were key to bringing this along with Michael Levine, who's sitting next to Laura Baldwin. And then finally, the empty chair is there in the pen tradition to honor the imprisoned Saudi writer Raif Badawi. So, this is the evening of the LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture. It's also the official opening of the 3rd annual 6 Degrees gathering. Tomorrow, 6 Degrees moves to the AGO for 2 days of intensive conversations, and then comes back here on Wednesday night for the closing and the presentation of the Adrian Clarkson Prize for Global Citizenship. The 3rd time it's been presented, first to the Aga Khan, to Ai Weiwei last year, and on Wednesday night to Margaret Atwood. In this theater tonight, there are 50 speakers who are taking part in 6 Degrees. They come from all over the world. Their role is to lead the conversation. You'll meet a few of them later on as we bring them into the conversation with Sue Gardner in place of a question and answer period, because we wanted you to start to get to know them because they know this subject really well. Hundreds of you are already coming to participate at the AGO over the next 2 days, and there'll be lots of time for more conversation. But if for some reason you don't have tickets and you want to come, just find somebody wearing a 6 Degrees ID and, get them to take you to somebody and it'll all get worked out. So as you know, Sue Gardner is our 16th lecturer. She's fast becoming the voice of justice, ethics, and responsibility when it comes to the internet. This morning, I don't know if you saw it, this morning it was announced that she has created an online non-profit publication called The Markup to investigate the way technology is used to shape our lives and our society. In other words, to investigate and publicize how big tech, the 5 monopolies, if you like, may be deforming the public interest. And I have to add that The Markup has been funded to the tune of $22 million. So this is a very serious intervention. And I was about to say congratulations to Sue, but I'm not quite sure that you should congratulate someone for creating something to deal with evil. I'm just not sure about that, but they're going to be doing very active investigating, which is very important. And you can see already why Sue Gardner is right in line with the work of LaFontaine and Baldwin. Let me add two quick thoughts about them, because every year I try to say something different, and they were so strange and varied in their ways, you can think of something new every year. So yes, they did maneuver London, the empire, into seating what they called responsible government, which was a very devious way of pretending that they weren't actually asking for independence, and which is what it was. They used an obscure term designed to avoid talking about what was really happening, that power was being peacefully transferred from an empire to the citizens of a colony. It was probably the first time in history that a colony talked its way out of an empire. And we've always been very good in this country at hypocrisy and complexity and weaving and dodging, because we've often had to deal with very large empires. It seems to be part of our life. And straight up talk just doesn't work. It wasn't just that power would move to the citizenry and their parliament, it was the revolutionary program. You saw some of that in the video that came with it. You saw the highlights of it. There were hundreds and hundreds of laws, of bills, of innovations, which are the foundations of what we are at our best today. We know there are lots of things where we're at our worst, but they're the foundation of what we are at our best. The real principles they put forward were ethical principles. Their message was a message of ethics, a message of the importance of an egalitarian society, dish with one spoon. It's so interesting. The society open to complexity, what today we would call diversity. This included immigration from all over the world, which is exactly what LaFontaine called it in 1840. And this was only possible because they believed the government governed for everyone. They knew then that you could not say, for example, we got X number of votes, which produced a majority, so we can do whatever we want. They understood that. They knew you couldn't say, we've got a mandate, so we can do whatever we want. They knew that the first responsibility of those with the majority of the seats is, in fact, to reach out to the rest of the population. It isn't democracy if you use power only for your own purposes. And therefore, even in disagreement, you must speak of your opponents with respect and recognize the dignity of the other branches of government, such as the judiciary. And you must respect the ethical intent of the Constitution, not the technical intent. In other words, they built a principle of government based on respect for the other and inclusion. And I had a last interesting comment. It was Robert Baldwin who put through the law, I believe in 1850, to create municipal democracy in Canada. And I've read that law, and I've read the speeches about it. And I can tell you that their intent was clear. It was to recognize the role of citizens at other levels of government, to recognize and respect them and their independent responsibilities, and not to jerk them around. Finally, the Great Ministry, as it was called, formalized our immigration system. We inherited it from the Indigenous people over 300 years as they welcomed us and invited us, and Chief LaForme spoke very eloquently of that this morning. Even if we betrayed it at a certain point, they welcomed us over a long period of time and helped us. In the summer of 1847, the Irish famine peaked. It had been going on for several years, and over those years, the number of starving Irish with typhus were effectively dumped into places like Canada by the imperial government in London. In 1847, without anybody knowing what was going to happen, 90,000 arrived in awful conditions, dying with communicable diseases, endangering themselves and the population here. The population of the city of Toronto tripled in 2 months in the summer of 1847. The government almost went bankrupt trying to protect both the refugees and the citizens at the same time. This irresponsible imperial disaster was key to the democratic forces, LaFontaine-Baldwin, the Reform Party as they called it, winning the election of January 1848. And what's fascinating is, for the ICC, Institute of Canadian Citizenship, and the 6 Degrees, what's fascinating is that the very first law passed by the very first democratic government of this Canada was an immigration law. And that law was put through in February 1848. It was a tough immigration law designed to protect the refugees and to organize the process of immigration. What we do today came out of that tumultuous time. So, yes, LaFontaine and Baldwin are the natural godfathers of 6 Degrees, and yes, Sue Gardner is very much in line with their ethics. Many of you know that she was the digital leader of CBC, and that she played a key role in building Wikipedia as we know it, one of the few online entities that still seems to believe in the public good. But she's gradually taken her distance from all of these structures. She's become one of the leading voices to emerge from Silicon Valley, from Canada and then Silicon Valley, and has devoted her life to transparency, ethical behavior, and the need to defend the public interest. Sue Gardner.
That's going to work. Hi. I want to start, if I can, by doing a little bit of a kind of temperature check on the room. So I have a couple questions I want to ask you, and I can see your faces, which is great. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand for me if. Have you found that over the last couple of years, the last 2, 3, 4 years, you are a more heavy consumer of the news, like following along better, consuming more news stuff than you used to do previously? Raise your hand if that is true. Okay. And have you found that in doing that, you still feel like you are missing stuff, like it is not always clear what to pay attention to, like it is extremely noisy and confusing, and you're not always sure that you're on top of things? Raise your hand if that's true for you. Okay, me too. So, yay, I am not alone. I was on Twitter the other day, and some guy tweeted saying that he felt like a dawning realization that he was having was that we're living through historically important times. And that made him realize that in his lifetime, that wasn't always true, right? We were not always living through historically meaningful times. He was talking about, the fall of communism, the end of apartheid. There are things that have happened in his lifetime, in my lifetime, that mattered a lot, but they really weren't the scale and scope of the kind of tectonic shifts that we can feel today. It's an important time, and it's a dangerous time. And it feels noisy and confusing. And so what I am going to try and do here tonight is I'm going to talk through a little bit of the kind of view from where I sit, the kinds of things that I have seen in my life. I'm going to talk a little bit about Silicon Valley. I'm going to talk about the news industry and changes there. And then I'm going to talk about some of what we know these days about the decline of trust in democracy and the decline in faith in democratic institutions. And then I'm going to try and gesture vaguely towards what I think we might want to do next. In doing that, I want to be super clear that, obviously I'm not standing up here saying I know what we should all think and I know the most important story. Journalism is the first draft of history. I was a journalist for a long time. I'm going to talk about my experiences and what I have seen. I know that you are going to bring to it your own experiences, your own knowledge. I know that many of you, as John said, are going to be here over the next couple of days at the AGO. I'm going to be there too, and I'm really looking forward to us kind of complexifying and having a joint conversation together where we come away smarter, all of us, than we are now, because I really deeply feel we are not getting smart enough faster. We have to do it a lot faster. So I'm looking forward to getting smart with you guys. So, for the last 11 years, I've lived in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. And I feel like living there, I think there's a phrase called catbird seat or something like that. I feel like I have had this sort of very privileged window onto many of the ways in which the world is changing. William Gibson had this famous line where he said, "The future is here, it's not evenly distributed yet." And I feel like San Francisco, what he said was true, and San Francisco is sort of the pointy end of this, right? It is where we are closest to the future, 5, 10, 15 years, I think, ahead of much of the rest of the world. What is coming for all of us has come there first. And so I want to start by describing a little bit about what my experience was like when I moved to the Bay Area in 2007 from Toronto. So I moved because I took the job at the Wikimedia Foundation, running the Wikimedia Foundation, which operates Wikipedia. It was an anomaly in the Bay Area, right? The Bay Area is a lot of tech companies. The Wikimedia Foundation is a tech company, but the Wikimedia Foundation is a nonprofit. It's a mission-driven organization. Our job was to bring the sum total of all human knowledge to everybody around the world in their own language for free. And we were doing it. We did it. We are doing it now. And so I am going to read you some quotes from back then about Wikipedia. So there's a journalist named Daniel Pink. He used to write for Wired magazine. He wrote one of the first, really, I thought, very thoughtful stories about Wikipedia. And in it, he said this. He said, "Wikipedia represents a belief in the supremacy of reason and the goodness of people." Cass Sunstein, who was an advisor to President Obama, a lawyer in DC, he wrote a book called Infotopia. And in that book, he said, "Wikipedia works because the people who know the truth are usually more numerous and more committed than the people who believe in a falsehood." And Nicholson Baker, who you probably know, is a fantastic, one of my favorite novelists, and also has written a lot of really great nonfiction. He wrote a piece in 2008 for the New York Review of Books, and he said this. He said, "Wikipedia flourishes because it's a shrine to altruism. It's a place for shy, learned people to deposit their trawls." I had to look up what trawls meant. But it was beautiful. It was a beautiful sentiment. It was a gorgeous piece. And the reason I read those quotes to you is two things. And one is because I would like to remind us all, if we were there, of how we all felt that way in the early days of the internet. Remember, we thought the internet was going to be a lot like Wikipedia, right? I remember working at the Wikimedia Foundation and waiting for the other Wikipedia-like things to come along. There was a time when we believed that the internet was going to be a fantastic accelerant for human beings. It was going to make us smarter. We were going to be more educated. We were going to be tolerant, and we were going to be wiser. And the other reason I read you those quotes was because I want you to understand that was my headspace, right, at the time. That was the world that I was living in. And so I had just taken this job. I was meeting Wikipedians, 100,000 people around the world write the encyclopedia. I was having meetups with them. We were going to conferences together. We were hanging out on IRC and on email mailing lists. And I was loving them. I was feeling super warmly embraced by them. And they would deny this, but my view is that they are all super altruistic people, right? Like super earnest, super altruistic, people like really working to make the world a better place. And what was interesting for me being in San Francisco was I would have conversations with the folks working in the tech industry. And I don't know if you remember this sort of era, but those conversations were very similar to the ones that I had with the Wikipedians, right? People talked about revolution, right? They talked about changing the world dramatically, making the world a hugely better place. There was a lot of rhetoric, and the conversations that were happening then at like for-profit companies, right, were very similar. At least the public conversations were very similar to what I was having with the Wikipedians. And yet, there were some things that I noticed, even in those early days. There were some sort of yellow flag kind of warning signs, and I want to tell you a little bit about what they were. So the first thing I noticed when I got to San Francisco, I was the executive director of a nonprofit organization, and what that meant was I tried really hard to hang around with rich people and tell them that the work that I was doing deserved to be supported by them. That's one of the jobs of being an ED, right? And so in my first few months in Silicon Valley, I went up and down the peninsula driving like a little rental car or something. And I had a whole series of meetings with entrepreneurs, with founders of companies, with folks who ran big companies, with people who ran like venture capital firms and hedge funds and their friends from private school. And the thing that dawned on me, it didn't take very long, was I never met another woman. I never met a single other woman. The only women I met, literally, this is literally true, in dozens of meetings over many months, the only women I met were booking the boardrooms for us, or they were asking us if we wanted drinks. That was the first red flag for me. The second red flag was I would go about my life, right, and I would like be in line at the coffee shop, or I would be in a cafe getting a sandwich or whatever, and around me, you know, if you've been to San Francisco, you know that it's like 1,000% tech, right? Everybody works in tech. Everybody who does not work in tech has been driven out of the city and lives like 500 miles away now. So I would be in these cafes or coffee shops or whatever, and the people around me all worked in tech, and they all looked like they work in tech. They looked like what was normal to me. They wore jeans and t-shirts and hoodies and running shoes. But the only thing that anybody ever seemed to be talking about was money. It was incredibly weird to me. It was like impossible to ignore. I'd be in the coffee shop and the guys in front of me would be talking about when they were going to do their IPO, right? Or they'd be talking about who was offering like a good deal on options and the vesting period was going to work out really well. Or like when they were going to get their Series C funding. And it was super weird because, again, they looked like engineers, right? But they talked like bankers. So I found that bizarre. When I lived in Canada, nobody ever asked me where I went to school. And if they did ask me, it was because they thought we might have friends in common. When I moved to the Bay Area, folks asked me all the time where I went to school, right? And I didn't really understand why they were asking me, and so I would, to be polite, right, I would ask them where they went to school, and then they would tell me that they went to Yale, right? Yale, Princeton, Stanford, lots of Ivy League schools, Harvard, et cetera, right? That was interesting because it was just disproportionate, right? It was a disproportionate number of people from extremely privileged backgrounds that I was interacting with. And I slowly, over time, came to realize what a monoculture Silicon Valley is. You know, it's almost entirely white and Asian people. Black people are massively underrepresented in Silicon Valley. Latino and Latina people also massively underrepresented. It's very young. Most people are in their 30s or in their 20s. I have a lot of friends in their 40s in the Bay Area, and they are advised by their marketing executives to like buy different jeans and stuff in an attempt to de-age themselves. It is super privileged. And of course, it's extraordinarily male, right? I mean, we all know that. Something like 85% of engineers in the Bay Area are men, right? Women are really dramatically underrepresented. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with being a white or Asian guy in your 20s, but obviously there is something very, very wrong with the absence of all the other kinds of people who could be represented there and aren't. And I think when I think about that, I think a lot of the seeds of the challenges that we're experiencing now because of Silicon Valley, they grow out of that lack of diversity, right? If you are a monoculture, if everybody is the same, you aren't as smart as you otherwise would be, right? You fall into groupthink. You don't see certain kinds of risks. The kinds of things that we see, like, you know, harassment on Twitter is a direct result of not having enough women, enough marginalized people in positions where they could call out the likelihood of stuff like that happening and guard against it. So I think some of the seeds of the problems that we've been having are from that. And then the last thing I want to call out is it became clear to me over time, and again, I'm hearkening back to my early conversations when I got there, the talk was of freedom and revolution and disruption and changing the world. And then the longer I was there, the clearer it became to me that the rhetoric was not matched by reality at all, and in fact, quite the opposite. And today, I think it's clear to everyone, and there's actually a joke that we sort of make in the Bay Area, which you might have heard, which is the products and services that get built in San Francisco Bay Area are typically exactly the kind of thing that you would expect to get built by a young man who just moved out of the house and who's looking to replace the labor that his mother used to provide for him, right? So there's like an app that will drop you off at the gym. There's an app that will bring you a grilled cheese sandwich. It will pick up your filthy laundry and it will come back and it's folded and it's neat and it's clean, right? So our talk was really big, but the works are actually like remarkably small. So I found all of that creepy and disconcerting, despite the fact that I was having a really good time in my actual work, but that part of Silicon Valley culture was super creepy and disconcerting to me. And at the same time, I had just left behind the news industry, and the news industry's business model was imploding and crumbling and falling apart. And I think that it's worth, I don't want to spend a long time on it, but I think it's worth talking about it for a minute because I think it's often misattributed. I think that this is a story where people are making up villains. They think that there are bad guys, and there actually are not. This is a historical accident story, right? Throughout much of the 20th century, the news industry did fine, and that was a historical accident, right? What happened was advertisers wanted to reach people with their marketing messages, and there were really only kind of two games in town for them. They could either advertise on broadcast television, or they could advertise in the newspaper. They had a couple other options like magazines, but mostly really that was what was open to them. And that was what fueled the journalism industry for a long time, for many, many decades. When the internet came along and started to become super popular, advertisers got tons more new options, right? There were many more different kinds of like content platforms that they could advertise on. And for the first time, they actually had the option to just go directly to real people, right? They could put up their own websites. They could commission the making of their own sort of viral videos and memes and things like that. And so what that meant was that journalism, which previously had been bringing in dollars, was suddenly bringing in pennies. And it was really bad for the industry. And so, for 20 years, we've been seeing this decline in the journalism industry. And one of the things that we've been seeing is, entire papers, local small papers, just completely disappearing. And so now we have news deserts in the same way that we've had food deserts, right? But I think the problem is actually worse than that, because I think what is less visible to us is the kind of hollowing out of the news institutions that we're used to. And the example that I think about a lot is the San Jose Mercury News in San Jose. It's a great old established newspaper. It's won a bazillion awards. It's done terrific investigative work. When it was at the peak of its power and influence, probably about 1989 or maybe the early 90s, it employed 440 people in its newsroom, and today it employs 39 people in its newsroom. And we know that same story is playing out in all kinds of news operations, right? To some degree, it's true in the Globe and Mail, right? To some degree, it's true at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Pick your paper, pick your broadcast outlet, right? We still have the copper plate logos up on the screen, right? We still have the sort of like, a lot of the signifiers of quality, right? There's good ethics policies, maybe there's an ombudsperson and that kind of thing. But the journalistic strength that underpinned the work that built those reputations that we so believe in, the strength is not there. The resource is not there the way that it used to be. And when I think about that, I think about the 2016 US presidential election campaign, right? I followed it closely. We all followed it closely. It was a train wreck. How could we not? And I think that if the measure of journalism is, were the citizenry sufficiently informed that they could make good decisions, right? I think it was really hard for people to follow along the coverage and learn what they needed to learn, right? Journalism just did not do a good job. I think what we're seeing is a rise in clickbait, a rise in sort of garbage news of a bunch of different kinds. Even again at these sort of august, old, fantastic institutions, there's sort of a tendency to kind of go where the clicks are leading them, and opinion is very cheap. And we're seeing a rise in kind of like what is called, I think, hate bait, right? Which is this idea that you hire columnists who have the opposite opinion of your core readers, and then you kind of troll your core readers into paying a lot of attention and getting really upset about it. That's what's happening inside the old institutions. And then we're also seeing, a rise of, we keep calling it news. We call it fake news, or we call it hyper-partisan news. There's a bunch of labels for it. But it isn't even really news, and we probably shouldn't talk about it in that way, because what it really is propaganda, right? I mean, it's not made with the intent to inform you, right? It's made with the intent to persuade you to feel a certain way. And all of that, I think, is corrupting our ability to, know what's going on and to make good decisions. I think that if you try really hard and you pay a lot of attention and you do a lot of kind of evaluative work, you can still make your way towards quality news and information. But honestly, I think for the average person, it's a lot to ask, right? They are awash in a sea of garbage, and it is a lot to ask them to, in effect, be like professional media critics every day in their daily lives. So, while the news industry was falling apart, the other thing that was happening was the internet was finding its feet, right? It was developing a business model. If you are as old as me, you will remember that when the internet first started, nobody knew what its business model was going to be, and a lot of fun was made about like pets.com and like different kinds of bubbles and stuff like that. But the internet has found its feet. It has found a business model. And I think it's important that we be super clear about what that business model is. And like I watched the Senate hearings with Facebook, as many of us did. The senators are not very clear, right? There's a lot of change. So I think you need to sort of be as crisp and articulate as you can be in sort of your understanding, right? The business model of the internet is this. Companies collect as much personal information and data about you as they possibly can. And then what they do is they sell access to you to people or institutions or companies that want to target you with various kinds of messaging. That's how it works. They're not selling your data. That's not what they're doing, but they're selling access to you on the basis of having collected a bunch of data about you so that you can be micro-targeted as like an 18-year-old woman who lives in Scarborough and watches Game of Thrones, right? So it's about targeting. There is a really beautiful quote. I don't know, there's a site called Metafilter that I hang out at a lot. It's like a really great site where people just talk about what's going on in the world and current events. And I think it was 2010, one of the folks on Metafilter, a guy named Blue Beetle is his username, and he had this great line, and he said, if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, you're the product that's being sold. Right? And I think that's like a super foundational insight into how the internet works, right? You are not paying for Facebook, you're not paying for Twitter, you're not paying for LinkedIn, you're not paying for any of these things. There is actually no such thing as a free lunch, right? You're not paying for it, and that means that you are being monetized. That's what's happening to you on the internet. And I think that business model, there are three, I think, elements of it that are super pernicious and problematic. The first one is the most obvious one, which is we have suffered a massive erosion in terms of our own personal privacy, right? I have given hour-long talks about this. I could talk about it for 100 years. I will keep it short here, and I'll pose sort of one question to you that I think sort of illustrates it. So it is September 24th, and it is 8 o'clock, I think, roughly, right? 2018. Can you remember, do you know where you were on September 24th at 8 o'clock at night in 2008? Take a minute. I will take a drink of water. Take a minute and see if you can think of that, if you can remember. You may ask your neighbors if they know. Does anybody know? Can anybody remember? Seriously, raise your hand. No. Okay. What? So I did this as an exercise for myself last night, and of course I had no idea, right? I was like, I have no idea. Like, how could I possibly know? And then I went into my Google account and sort of dug it out of my location history in Google. I was in Bangalore. I was asking a wealthy Indian person for money for Wikipedia. Welcome to my life. But of course, I would not have known that, right? The only way I knew that was because Google knew that. That is deeply terrifying, right? Google knows more about me than I know about myself. That is a weird asymmetry. It is not just true of Google, it is true of Facebook, it is true of LinkedIn, it is true of all the services with which I interact. And the problem with it is that they can lose my data and then it's on the street and someone else can find it. They can be hacked and my data can be taken from them. Various kinds of actors can use that data. They can use it against me in a variety of different kinds of ways, some of them potentially legitimate, some of them less legitimate. I have lost control of it, and there's a fundamental asymmetry there, which is machines and huge corporations know more about me than I know about myself, right? So the erosion of personal privacy is a major pernicious effect. A second downstream pernicious effect is the idea that so if the companies are going to monetize information about you, what that means is it's very much in their interest for you to be continuously generating new data for them. And that has had a real sort of shaping effect on how our internet experiences have developed. So, you know, if I got to design my own internet experience, it might be the case that, like, let's say I would want to spend all my time reading extremely long and thoughtful articles. That actually doesn't do anybody else much good, right? It's much better for the internet if I am constantly, like, clicking things and sharing things and liking things and interacting in a variety of ways, because all of that is signal for the companies that they can use, right, to then sell me as an audience to somebody else. Tim Wu is a law professor at Columbia, and he's written a couple of really fantastic books about how the internet's developed. In 2010, he wrote a book called The Master Switch, and then I think in about 2016, he wrote a book called The Attention Economy, which was all about this. And in it, he calls this the casino effect. And the idea is, you know, and this was actually the genesis for his book, you're like lying around on the sofa, it's a Sunday afternoon, you're kind of poking at your phone a little bit, and then hours pass, right? 45 minutes is gone, 2 hours is gone, and you sort of look up, and you haven't even had a particularly kind of fulfilling experience. You haven't learned anything new, right? But you also haven't even really enjoyed yourself, right? You've been just kind of poking at your phone, and maybe you laughed a little bit, and maybe something made you kind of mad for a second, but really you've just lost a bunch of time and you have nothing to show for it. So what we wanted the internet to be and then what it has become for us because of the way that it is monetized or monetizing us has had a cost to us of hours of our time, right? Like our time, our energy, our attention just getting sort of frittered away in stuff that is not that interesting or helpful. And then the last pernicious effect that I would call out is that if micro-targeting people for persuasive messages, if that's your business model, then it is in your interest to have a large volume of people and organizations doing that micro-targeting, because that's where your money comes from, right? What that means is a number of companies have grown up, primarily Facebook and Google, but also other companies, and they have made it incredibly cheap for you, for anyone, to use fairly sophisticated marketing techniques to reach individual kinds of people. So I said a minute ago, the 18-year-old who likes Game of Thrones and lives in Scarborough, right? Those are the kind of audiences that you can build to target on social media. And it's incredibly cheap. I don't know if you've ever bought a Facebook ad. I have. You can pay $30, $100. That's a really different world from what advertising used to look like when it was like Nike and BMW, right? You had to have teams to build, gorgeous videos, and then you had to buy time and have a strategy and all of that. And today, anybody has access to that enormously, robust, persuasive machinery, right? And so that means it gets used by anybody. I was on Twitter the other day, and I saw a whole bunch of promoted messages about how immigration is bad, right? I mean, that is new. I don't know who made those things. There's no transparency. There's no accountability. I don't know where they came from. I don't know why they showed them to me. So, all of this is terrible. The internet that we thought was going to be terrific and make us more tolerant and wiser and more open and better has done the opposite. What it has become is a kind of a shopping mall, crossed with a panopticon, right? It exists to sort of titillate our basest instincts. We put it to the most pedestrian possible uses, and we also put it to uses that are actually dangerous, right? They are unhealthy and they are dangerous. I'm going to zoom out now, and I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about democracy. So, if you are going to be with 6 Degrees over the next couple of days, Yascha Mounk is going to be speaking, I think, tomorrow. Yascha is a political scientist from Harvard. If he were in the room right now, I would honestly just turn the mic over to him for a couple of minutes to do this part of my talk, because his research is fantastic. You can, if you will be with us, you can consider this a kind of a foreshadowing. I'm going to mention some of his research and other people's research. Getting ready for tomorrow. So, there have been survey, lots of study done about people's attitudes towards democracy. And the picture that is being painted by that work is all really bleak. I'm going to read you some statistics. So currently, 53% of people around the world believe that the current system is failing them, that it is unfair, and it does not offer them hope for the future. In Canada, it used to be the case that most people did not believe that. Most people had faith in the system, but I think last year was the first time that Canada tipped, and now a majority of Canadians also believe that the system is not fair. Around the world, only 15% of people believe that the system is working. Over the past 30 years, people who live in long-standing democracies have become less likely to agree that it is essential to live in a democracy. The number of people who say that they would rather have, quote, a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections is rising in Germany, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Norway, in the United Kingdom, the United States, and I think something like 24 other countries. The younger you are, the less likely you are to believe that democracy is essential. And this is a reversal from older studies. So in older studies, young people were the most pro-democracy, but that has flipped in the last, I think, 20 years. And so, of people born during the these are American numbers, of people born during the interwar years, 90% say that it's important to get to choose your leader in a free election. If you look at baby boomers, it drops to 86%. And if you look at millennials, it drops to 74%. So that means 1 of 4 younger people does not think it matters that you get to choose your leader in a free election. That's the United States, but the trend is the same in liberal democracies in Europe and outside Europe. And support for authoritarianism is rising everywhere. So in the past 30 years, the number of people in the United States who think that army rule would be a good thing is rising. So in 1995, 1 of 16 Americans thought that army rule would be a good thing. And today, 1 of 6 Americans thinks that army rule would be fine. And again, the trend is the same in almost all the mature democracies, right? It's the same in Germany, it's the same in Sweden, it's the same in the United Kingdom. So we're a culture that has seen a decline in trust overall, right? Our belief in the institutions of democracy is shaken. We don't have the level of faith that we used to have. And I think that that is for real reasons, right? I mean, governments have lied to people, they have shaded the truth, they have misled. Politics is getting much more partisan, which makes people feel alienated from it. We see Black people, Indigenous people getting killed, and then sometimes there is no accountability for that when it happens. We see women get harassed, they get sexually assaulted, they get raped. The justice system is not working for us. And so I think that people are falling away, right? Their faith in the system is falling away. They're tired of getting spun, they're tired of getting fucked over, honestly. But none of that is entirely new, right? And so there's a question, which is, why is the faith in our institutions plummeting right now, right? When corruption and lies and impunity and lack of accountability are surely not at their peak in our history, right? So why is this happening now? In countries around the world, why are people leaning authoritarian in ways that they didn't used to? And why do we feel so alienated and so cynical and so disengaged? I think that there are probably a lot of potential explanations, and the reality is it's probably complex. There are probably multiple things going on that kind of like coincide with each other, and it's also true that it's not the kind of thing that is knowable, right? We will never know the answer. But I think that there is a case to be made that this plummeting of faith in democracy and democratic institutions happening right now all around the world. What is the thing happening right now all around the world? It's the internet. That is the thing that has changed for everyone all at once, that is not so affected by your specific location, right? And it's true that the internet did destroy the news business. It didn't mean to do that, but it did it. It is true that the internet did open the floodgates to a million miles of crackpot ideas and conspiracy theories and hate speech and all manner of garbage and nonsense. We used to have a kind of immune system, love it or hate it, the gatekeepers that we had, but they were gatekeepers. We don't have them anymore. And then I think, worst is that the business model of the internet, this attention economy, right? The business model of the internet means that the internet makes its money by having you stick to it and pay attention to it and be glued to your phone. And the way that it does that is algorithmically feeding you stuff that is ever increasingly sort of outrageous and thrilling and shocking and deeply upsetting, right? So it is, I think, not the case that most people are out there looking for Holocaust denialism, right? Or looking for conspiracy theories about chemtrails, right? I think there's a myth that the internet gives us what we want and we should blame ourselves because what is wrong with us that we want all this garbage. I don't think that that myth is true. I think the internet feeds us stuff to keep us on it and tricks us into accepting that. Someone told me just tonight that Facebook employs, I think it was 4,000 behavioral psychologists, right? There are a lot of people. It's you, one person with one phone, right? And you are against armies and armies, thousands of people who are trying to trick you into staying there, right? What is the right musical tone that will keep you? What perfect color will sort of, keep your attention? I'm going to do one more quote, and then I'm going to start to wrap up. There is a woman who I think is just such a fantastic and insightful thinker about all of this stuff. Her name is Zeynep Tufekci. She is a sociologist. She was originally a computer programmer, and then she became a sociologist, and I think the world got much richer as a result because she has the technical chops and she also has the understanding about people. And she wrote a book a couple of years ago, I think it was called Twitter and Tear Gas. And this is just a quote from Twitter and Tear Gas that I think kind of encapsulates where we are. She said this. She said, "Our new era is marked by the multitude of people and institutions with the capacity to broadcast, each with different normative standards, and some with no concerns about accuracy, even as a standard that isn't always upheld. We have a polarized public with little trust in any intermediary, which is drawn to information that confirms its pre-existing biases. And the result is a frayed, incoherent, and polarized public sphere." So that was Zeynep Tufekci. So I have said a lot of stuff here today. I assume that you have made your own observations, you've thought your own thoughts about what I'm saying. You come into the room with your own ideas and your own experiences and your own knowledge. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with those of you who will be here over the next couple of days. I'm going to take one more minute to sum up where I think we're at and what I think should happen next. So there has always been a social contract, right? In the Middle Ages, there was a king, and the king let people, till the soil on his land, and maybe he protected them against neighboring bandits or warlords, and in exchange, they gave him some of their harvest. In the 1950s and the 1960s, you would take a job working at General Motors. Maybe you did not love your job. It was not like the most fun you ever had, but it did pay your mortgage and it got your kids through college. And you paid your taxes and GM paid its taxes. And the result of that was that the government was able to provide services for all of the people, and especially was able to look after people who were poor or sick or old or unemployed, right? So there was a social contract. My dad was a soldier so that, my grandfather was a soldier so that my father could be a farmer so that I could be a poet. Right? The idea was that there was progress. Things were we were all going to slowly, jointly work together towards better all the time. That was the goal of what we were trying to do. I think that social contract was obviously always hugely problematic, right? People were left out of it. There were always people who, profited from the lack of freedoms and the lack of opportunities of other people. But there was, at least in theory, a contract that we were working towards, and to some degree it was succeeding for our culture. I think that sometime in the 1980s, we decided to behave differently. I have a friend who describes it as we decided to pretend that we were poor, right? So we began to take measures of austerity. We began to believe that we couldn't afford things that we always had afforded to provide for our people, for the citizens of the country. And I think that in the years since then, we've been letting our social contract wither and die. Income inequality and wealth inequality are skyrocketing. I am not an economist. I do not know the last time that real wages rose, but I think it was at least 10 years ago, and it was maybe significantly longer than that. I think that this may be somewhat particular to the United States. I don't know the situation in Canada, but in the United States, at least, what we are finding is that frivolous things, so like televisions and clothes, are getting super cheap, right? It is super cheap to buy a lot of frivolous stuff, but the actual basics that people need to live their lives, things like education or healthcare, are getting remarkably expensive. The average American doesn't have the savings. If they lost their job, they'd be homeless in a couple of months. So the system, for increasing numbers of people, it just isn't working. I feel like I can see this even with friends of mine who are like really kind of privileged, right? I have a number of friends who are baby boomers. They have adult children, and their children despite their parents, having done really well for themselves, their children are not. Their kids are suffering from long-term depression. Some of them are addicted to various kinds of pharmaceuticals. They haven't worked for a long time. They're not necessarily going to be able to work. One of the things I find interesting is that my friends in that situation, they all seem to internalize it and make it individual, and so they worry, like, what is wrong with my son, right? I don't think it's the son, right? I think it's the culture. I think that things are very, very frayed, and people notice it when it's close to them. They maybe don't see it more broadly than that. And so the question is, what do we do about that? I think what we need to do, I think we need to build a new social contract. That's my argument. I think that the broken social contract is at the root of a lot of the problems that we're experiencing. Not all of them, but many of them. I think if we fix it, we fix a whole lot of things. If you have a functioning educational system and you have a world in which people don't need to worry that they're going to go bankrupt and lose their house if they get hit by a truck, I think that then it's a less receptive environment for conspiracy theories. It's a less receptive environment for the alt-right. I think when people are afraid, they get mean. I think if they feel like they live in a culture that is going to care about them and support them and look after them, and they can be educated and they can have a functioning news industry, I think everybody is better off. I think we used to know that, and somehow we forgot it. So my hope is that over the next couple of days, that's the world that I want to live in. I hope and assume it's the world that you want to live in too. And I hope that over the next couple of days, we're going to get to have that conversation together. Thank you so much.
Well, Sue, I thought that was great, wonderfully optimistic, and
I'm so sorry.
no, I thought it was, you put a lot of things together. I mean, I think a lot of people in the room would know bits and pieces of it,
Yeah.
but it's very rare to hear it all put together. And I think that's really, really important because I think, I'm not sure if it was in the announcement of your new venture, that you're talking about how it's very hard to have a conversation about the social contract when people don't have the knowledge to include the internet in that conversation. It's sort of like the most important piece at the moment. People don't know how to talk about it, really.
Yeah, it's funny, and Silicon Valley is absolutely amazing at marketing itself. It always has been. And I think that one of the things that Silicon Valley has done super successfully is to persuade people that they don't understand it, they can't understand it, and that makes them stupid, right? And it's actually been a really great way to, I think, neutralize a whole generation of people who otherwise would have brought a lot to the table in terms of being like healthily critical, healthily skeptical about technology, is that if people feel like they can't say anything because they're going to use the wrong word or they're going to slightly misunderstand algorithms or something, it's a silencing effect.
You're describing my life.
Yeah, no, I'm sure, right? I'm sure. And I feel like part of my life, honestly, part of my life is like saying to people like you, like just like speak up, right? Like everybody, right? Like when we are silenced, it's better to speak our truth, I mean, we will gain more ground that way, right, than if we're silenced.
But I mean, social contracts were built very carefully often. I mean, there were a lot of battles and fights, and people were very organized, and it was structures, and they built these social contracts, and sometimes there were revolutions. I mean, the LaFontaine-Baldwin social contract was built. It took
years to get everybody to understand what it was and to come out. And there were riots, and very violent riots, actually, in those days. And in fact, Baldwin had to save his life several times by running across fields with Orange Order mobs with clubs behind him. And he seemed to be a good runner in spite of everything. I don't know, because he outran. Maybe they were drunk. I don't know. But so, I mean, how do you actually build your way into a social contract when you're dealing with something which is in a way so amorphous, and it moves when you try to get at it? I mean, I guess that's part of what you're going to be doing in your new work.
No, I happily, with my new thing, I'm going to be criticizing, not solving problems. I'm going to be like waving flags of problems, which I think is a lot easier, right? I don't know how that hard work gets done. I assume like it's what you say, like it takes a long time. There's a lot of negotiation. Probably missteps are made, right? And things need to be reworked. And, I don't know how that work gets done, but I think it takes a long time, so we should get started, I guess.
One of the most interesting things, and I mean, you haven't been living in Canada, is that I sense there's a kind of eagerness here to say, well, we have to get a piece of this. So there's a kind of eagerness to sign treaties and come to agreements at the same time that the Russians and the Chinese, for their own problematic reasons, have walked away, and the Europeans have started passing laws to box in the monopolies. And Canada's, and maybe Australia, I'm not sure, Daniel Webb's here, he would know better than me. I mean, we seem to be we're being very naive to think that this is a time to be signing treaties. It's way too early to be coming to if you sign a treaty now, you're basically signing on in sort of the early stages of something and giving power to the people who have power now.
Well, and I feel like and I've been away, but it feels like to me that the orientation of Canada towards the platforms is more of an economic orientation than a cultural one, right? And so it's like, will there be jobs, and can we have incubators here, and can we build companies here, right? So it's more about the sort of the economic how it plays out financially, right? Whereas I think one of the things that has been missing is the more protectionist stance, right? Whether it's the protection of Canadian culture, which I haven't been here in a long time. I do feel, I come and go, right? When I come back, I do feel like there's a bit of a change in the way Canadians are in the world, right? Like I think, we had decades of cultural protectionist policies that were designed to preserve and enable the continued growth of a Canadian identity, right? We've now had this experiment. The internet is how culture is transmitted today. And so we've now had this experiment with an unregulated internet for 20 years, right? It shouldn't be surprising to anybody if that has a lot of effect on what Canadians are like. There's a lag, right? But 20 years of that has, I think, probably made some changes in what it means to be a Canadian, what it feels like to be a Canadian, the kinds of influences that you have, right? That's invisible, but I think it's still very real. I don't think Canada has been considering that. Has Canada been considering that?
I think you're right. I think, whenever I found myself in a public meeting in Ottawa or something with senior civil servants, they seem to be talking about the internet the way they talked about the trade in pork bellies in the 1950s.
Right.
It's seems to me simplistic and naive. They talking about it as if it was a trade good. And they don't really seem to understand clearly what the Europeans have understood, which is that it's something which needs to be structured, put under laws, managed, controlled.
Completely, and I'll tell you...
For the sake of democracy, not for the sake
of
authority.
Absolutely, no. And I'll tell you that, when I talk to engineers who work at Google or Facebook or YouTube or whatever, Germany, the EU, but mostly Germany really, is the only thing that they're paying any attention to, right? Because they are not being constrained in any kind of useful way in the United States or elsewhere. It's really primarily Germany, but also the EU. And I would say that, again, this is an area where the tech companies have done a really terrific marketing job because when I hear them talk about the EU, what they say is, oh, you know, they're very fusty, right? They're very old, like their regulations are terrible. Nobody likes their regulations. That's nonsense, right? Like that's just like, that is a self-interested thing to say. But the truth is that Germany and the EU have made things better for everybody, because what actually happens is the tech companies will implement a change that's required for privacy protective reasons, usually, in Europe, and then they will roll it out for the rest of the world on the expectation that it's just as easy to do it for everybody all at once. And maybe the regulation is going to crop up similarly in other places, and so sometimes they'll just kind of like give it to you in advance on the expectation that you're going to demand it. So what Canada should be doing is following the lead of Europe, because that is what's actually making changes in how the platforms work.
So I suppose if you are the government of the monopolies, or you're those monopolies, what you want to do is get as many countries as possible to sign in now, so that they have to follow your rules rather than the more sophisticated pro-democracy rules of Europe.
Presumably.
I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, tell me something. You mentioned about how there are virtually no women. And I know we've had conversations in Silicon Valley, and we've had conversations about this. I mean, what's your sense of the effect of what's happening on, you know, are we in the third or do you belong to the third wave of feminism or the fourth wave?
Is there a fourth wave?
Is there a fourth
no.
wave? We're still in the third.
Yeah.
And so what, you know, in many ways, of course, enormous progress is finally starting to be made. I mean, it went so slowly for so long, not because people weren't working day and night, but the resistance was enormous. The structures were not at all favorable, and people the men held on to those structures, still are in large part. And it seems to be moving now in all sorts of very personal ways, and yet I think I have the sense from you that you feel that what's happening through the internet is a real danger to all of that.
I don't know how much I would attribute this to the internet, but I don't think things are getting I don't think things are getting better for women. I just don't think so, right? I think that, like, my heart has been breaking for the last couple of days because of the situation with Brett Kavanaugh, right, where we are seeing a reprisal, a continuation of what happened to Anita Hill. That was how many years ago, right? That was 22, 24 years ago. And we're going to get the same outcome, right? So I guess what I feel like is, you know, women go on the internet, they speak their piece, they get harassed, they get rape and death threats, they get forced offline. Women, I gather there have been a number of studies that say that women participate less in the public sphere today than they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, online, right?
Really?
Yeah, because they're getting pushed out. Like, who would sign up for that? It's bonkers, right? So they get pushed out of public spaces in that way. And then I see stuff like this Kavanaugh thing where, you know, this is like the 5th round of women telling their stories of assault and rape on Twitter, right? We had didn't report, I forget, it was started by Antonia Zerbezius, was raped, never reported. I can't remember all the hashtags, but there have been multiple hashtags where women are just like pouring out their pain and the terrible things that have happened to them on the internet, and we all kind of wallow in like the emotion of that. But nothing's changed, right? If Kavanaugh goes on the Supreme Court with 2 accusers, like, tell me how that's better than what happened to Anita Hill, right? It's not different. I feel like we talk a lot about progress, and I feel like when Donald Trump got elected, that was a kick in the teeth, right? Like, that tells me how much people care about women.
So how...
Makes me so mad, you know?
So what do you, I mean, to take this to an even more depressing level, how do you think, what form does that take, if there's a backward move, if we're already in it? Is it the taking apart of laws? Once people have Supreme Courts and majorities, they just start removing the laws?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, right? Like, abortion is still legal in the United States. Who knows what will happen to Roe v. Wade, but it's harder and harder and harder to get an abortion for most women, right? And so I guess one of the things that happens is, you know, the middle class is disappearing, and so wealthy people will have access to whatever, right? And more poor women will have less access to things. That's one of the things that will happen. I don't know what it's like here in Canada. If women in Canada, it may be the case, right, that women in Canada feel like they are making progress, and that the United States is unusually having a setback that doesn't apply outside it. I don't know.
But I mean, you have to, you know, it's always that danger because the United States is the place.
Yeah.
But in fact, you know, there's Canada, there's Mexico, there's Latin America, there are all those countries in Europe. You now have a straight line of fundamentally anti-democratic governments in Central Europe. You've got, you know, a whole bunch of things are happening, and one has to kind of look at the balance and averages.
Totally.
So if you see 8 countries moving backwards for women, then that's a sign that something is happening, and it may spread, and you don't know how it's going to spread.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also true that, like, the United States is the behemoth, right? And so the coarsening of the discourse and the way women are being talked about and treated, it does filter to other places. So even if it was only the United States, there would still be some degree of spillover effect, I think.
Right. Let's go to Bianca Wiley, who's one of the speakers at 6 Degrees, who's somewhere over there, I think, no?
Hello.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah. And Bianca is from Toronto. She's a writer and an advocate, and I've had fantastic conversations already with you. So.
Likewise, thank you. Thank you, Sue, for your remarks. They were wonderful. And I think as John said, getting our heads around this story is difficult. And I think right now is a time where we're going to need to admit we don't know how things work, and that, you know, that we have to say, I don't know a lot. So I think to your point, I'm really looking forward to this next couple days to think together. One of the things you spoke about was this sort of need for a villain, or this idea that there may be villains in the tech sector. Yep. And I wanted to riff on that a little bit. When I got really scared was when I was watching the Facebook Senate hearings. And Senator Al Franken got up, or he was sitting, but I mean, he went on a bit of a tear, and he said, you know, how people are buying ads in rubles. Look at the volume on these ads. How could you not know what was going on? And the internet's, you know, clapping and cheering and happy and get them. And I'm sitting there thinking, Mr. Franken, Facebook is not in charge of elections. And so what I'm terrified about right now is that I think we're forgetting who's in charge of things. And this is scary to me. Because what I know is sometimes right now when politicians don't know what to do about technology, guess who they call? Yeah. Facebook, Google. This is who they call for help. And so I think part of this discussion right now is this sort of, is this, given all the research you spoke of as well, there is a crisis in belief in the state, but I have this hope that this is a time for us to realize the power of law and maybe to come around to that and to participate in this discourse. Ralph Nader is speaking tonight in Ottawa. Consumer protection may be coming back in style. But in the face of that, and I'll kind of point or pose my question, at the same time as I want to feel hopeful about these things, I've also spoken to many people who are quite excited by technology, who have benefited from all of its conveniences, and who have told me that as long as it's working well for them, they're actually quite happy to extend the social contract to include corporations. And so I think there's a libertarian bent to Silicon Valley, and that sort of thinking that is quite dominant right now. And so I think those are, I feel like we're in a fork in the road here where maybe I'm nostalgic for the role of the state, but I'd like to see it exert itself right now. But I also see serious challenges to that. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
I think you are super, super, super correct, right, about the role confusion. And I've been perplexed by that forever. I don't understand it. I've been hearing people talk about first Google and now Facebook as though they were governments for years, and it's super confusing. Like I remember a long time ago, remember when Facebook was doing, I think it was called Facebook Flu, right? Where you could go online, you could see a map of like where the flu was happening and you could sort of protect yourself or whatever. That was the first time that I started seeing this. I'd be at conferences and people would be like naming some social ill, some sort of social challenge. And they'd be like, gosh, you know, like wouldn't it be great if Facebook, or at the time Google, if Google could take that on, like their engineers could totally solve that problem. And I think that that was because they seemed, I'm thinking about it now, right? They seemed like miracle workers, right? And if government wasn't feeling super successful to you, like it couldn't get stuff done, it's like the line at the DMV is always really long or whatever, then the tech companies would feel like magicians, like they were capable of pulling off these enormous feats that your government actually couldn't do. And of course, the reason for that is because they got to cherry pick what they were interested in. They got to do things that were exciting and easy as opposed to things that were difficult and slow. And by the way, had to work for everybody, not just for people with the newest phone or whatever. But that confusion has been around for a long time. And I agree with you that I think we see it even at government itself. Like, was it here that, what was the deal with the next election? That Facebook is going to, in some way, help with security, helping the government kind of batten down the hatches. And does anyone know about that?
I don't know this. I mean,
because
that must be a nightmare.
Maybe. No, I remember hearing this when I was last in Ottawa, I think.
Really?
I remember people were talking about this, yeah, that somehow Facebook
Does anybody know about this? Yeah.
Yes?
Haroon.
Is it true? Please.
Haroon Siddiqui. Somebody's running with a mic.
They're coming for you.
Coming for you, Haroon.
We build exercise into this whole thing, yes.
No, sorry, our government has been in awe of high tech, genuflecting to it for the last 4 or 5 years or so. Totally remiss in understanding the points that you have made about loss of privacy, loss of sovereignty, and so on and so forth. And among the many things they have done is they turn to the devil to fix the elections. Mm-hmm. So there's a broad agreement, the outlines of which we still do not know, that they have turned over this function of safeguarding the next election to Facebook. That's what has happened.
Wow. Okay.
We will see the details as they emerge, but that's the spirit of it.
But there is a formal agreement.
I don't know if there's a formal agreement, but there were certainly announcements to that effect by the 2 cabinet ministers.
It's super interesting. It's super interesting. And I do think that part of what is happening there is, again, like people aren't sure how the technology works, and there seem to be these magicians who can help you figure it out, right? A woman I know in the United States at the Ford Foundation, she did this thing that I thought was super cool, where she brought together a bunch of sort of civic tech people and had them sit down with government people and civil rights organizations, a bunch of advocacy organizations, because they want to make cases of various kinds on behalf of their constituents, et cetera. They didn't understand the technology well enough to do it, and she was afraid that if they didn't create sort of ways for them to learn faster, those people would just accept whatever they were told by the tech companies, right? So they brought in civic tech people to do that coaching and training work, because it is a lot of work, right? Like people don't know stuff, they have to learn stuff. And so the question becomes, who are they learning it from, right? And it sounds like here maybe they are learning it from Facebook, right? From Google.
So is this, I mean, it goes back to, I think you said it at the beginning, this sort of idea that if somebody wears a hoodie or a t-shirt, it says something about them, as opposed to being a kind of the invisible man. I don't know if you ever read the H.G. Wells novel. I mean, they become invisible as to what they really are, which is a monopolist. And somehow the people are seduced by the very superficial appearance.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, also, Silicon Valley has deep countercultural roots, right? And there is there's a piece of the counterculture that is, I guess, super libertarian, right? And so that's a part of it too, right? We look at people who look like that and we think, I don't know what we think they're subversive, right?
But they're not.
No.
No. Let's try another, which is Sheyi Akiwowo from London. And Sheyi was elected, I think, the youngest black councillor elected, what, 2 years ago, 4 years ago?
I was 22.
You were 22. And which is a very interesting way to start your life. And Sheyi is one of our ICC fellows. So this is a program where this year, it's only the third year, about 300 people applied and 10 people were chosen, and they're all doing programs or projects in their different countries and across Canada that have somehow to do with immigration, refugees, diversity, and so on. So, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I think you've cured my jet lag because I'm buzzing and I've been struggling to stay awake. So thank you so much for your insight. It's been fantastic. Yeah, I have a few thoughts on what you've said, so I hope you don't mind me sharing that. I think the first thing I want to follow up on is the silencing effect that you spoke about. So through, I guess, being one of the youngest councillors, being black, and being a female, everyone was like, whoa, what's happened here? You don't look like our normal councillors, and that brought a lot of attention, which was great. It meant that in a way, I started a contract with social media to use this platform to engage more women and more people of colour into politics and raise issues that affected urban youth, and honour my friend who died, who was stabbed at a party. So it was great. It was a good contribution to the world, and it was a great way for me to have a platform. I started getting followers. I thought Idris Elba was going to notice me. I was going to get on the Ellen show. I thought, yes, I've made it. And then I make a speech doing something like this, and the speech goes online, it went viral, and then in came an onslaught of abuse. And that silencing effect, I wasn't annoyed at the abuse, and Amal was called some horrible things, and there was death threats, and because I was a counsellor, my address is public, so there was a real concern for my safety, and I was on the Joe Cox program as well. Joe had just died not even a year ago when it happened, so it wasn't that. It was these social media companies. They took me for a mug. I reported the incidences, I reported the abuse, and I never got anything back. And I think rethinking this social contract in those kind of terms would be amazing, because I think a lot of young people going on this online platform, wanting to be an Instagram influencer, wanting to change the world, and then something happens on the platform and these tech companies are nowhere to be seen. And we were talking earlier, Bianca and I, about black feminists online. They're the ones that are keeping Twitter alive, like their content.
Yep.
Their content, their creativity, Black Girl Magic, Insecure, it's amazing. Like, we are keeping the platform alive, and yet the tech companies, when women are being abused and threatened, they're nowhere to be seen. So I think some thinking around the social contract around that would be great. Oh gosh, my security settings on my phone means that I have timed out. Also, I wanted to share some thoughts around this term digital citizenship. So we go into schools and talk to young people about the online world being an extension of the offline world, and knowing that we've got a right to be online, but we've also got responsibility. So I wonder if your social contract rethinking can also include some thoughts around how we all pick up the kind of litter online. We've all got a responsibility to make it clean and be active bystander and have each other's back. If somebody hit me today, and no one dare do that, but if somebody hit me right now, I would hope that majority of you would have a knee-jerk reaction to want to come and help me and protect me. How do we engage young people or the next generation or people in this room to see the online world in that same sense? So I would wonder if you could have some thoughts on that. And also how we start thinking bigger around digital citizenship, around education, but having a stakehold, maybe like an internet governance, around kind of tackling this term fake news, how we start participating in what we want to be seen. Like, I don't know if we get some shares because these are our data, but just thinking bigger around this kind of our inputs coming and us getting something out of it. And just to digress a little bit, I know you mentioned Trump, and that if Americans voted for Trump, that they don't like women. But how are we going to face the uncomfortable truth that 53% of white women also voted for Trump? Yeah. And I think, yes, social media companies and tech and bots have all got a part to play, but I think also internet just pulls up a mirror to society. I think we all want to say that we've progressed and we moved on. The UK like to think that they've progressed as well, but actually I don't think they have. And actually I think the internet is an insight into how much more work needs to be done when we talk about inclusion and cohesion. And that's why I think this social contact theory is a really good point, because I think we all have a responsibility to help fix the glitch. We all have a responsibility to make the online world a safer space. And I think us moving towards a feminist approach to the internet, there's feminist principles online, I think it's like 16 now, but one of them is around a commune, actually us all having a stake in this and all us kind of getting our shares out of it and no one owning it, no one monopolizing it, but having a feminist approach where we kind of we start readdressing the balances of power. But for everybody, so for women, for people of color, for LGBT, for all the marginalized voices. That's my contribution.
Thank you. So I am really looking forward to talking with you a lot over the next couple of days. Seriously, there's like 20 things in there that I want to talk with you about, right? One thing I will say for now, and then we can pick up the conversation later, is that one of the things that was really interesting about being at Wikipedia, we did a lot of research into the motivations of Wikipedians, because we wanted to understand, like they were the gold, right? They were the resource. They were the people making this awesome encyclopedia. And so we wanted to understand what made them want to do it, so we could try to make more people want to do it. The single biggest motivation was showing off, right? They wanted to like, look at how smart I am. I did this thing, right? They were into it for that reason. But the second biggest reason people gave for contributing was that no one was profiting off their contribution, right? So when Wikipedia was first made, it was nothing. It was not an organization. Jimmy Wales made it into a nonprofit about 2 years in, I think, and he did it because the German Wikipedians, I think particularly, but a lot of Wikipedians told him that they did not want to work on someone else's farm, right? Like they didn't want to work making money for somebody else. And I think that is a kind of foundational challenge with the internet today. People will work for platforms that, I'm talking about your picking up litter thing, right? People will work for Reddit, or they'll do a little volunteer moderation on OkCupid or something. If they feel personally invested in a platform, they will help out. But I think that for the most part, people look at the platforms and they think you are making billions of dollars every year and you're not even paying taxes. Like, why would I, like I feel that way when I report harassment on Twitter, right? Like I report it because it feels disgusting not to report it, but I also resent having to report it, right? Like there are companies that could afford to have large moderation teams, you know, without deeply harming their bottom lines, right? But I think that your notion about, I think, changing the terms, right? That kind of has to be done, because if we're going to see the internet as these sort of adversarial relationships with like mega trillionaires, nothing good can come of that, right? So the base relationship, I think, does need to be renegotiated to allow for picking up litter. And the other piece of that is that the platforms have to own their responsibility for things too. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
So maybe as a last sort of question, I mean, you take that and take the next step. I mean, yes, confidence in the existing systems has gone down. Mm-hmm. We've allowed ourselves to fall into talking about, not about citizens, but about clients. You know, hospitals have clients. Really? I thought they were sick. Yeah. You know, they're there to buy something? I mean, yeah. You know, stakeholders. I mean, all of us use this term stakeholder, which is a Mussolinian term, that mm-hmm. instead of a democracy, only people with interests are allowed to speak together.
Oh, that's interesting.
You know, as opposed to people who believe in the public good. Uh-huh. And so we've fallen into this sort of misuse or forgetfulness about what democracy feels like and what citizenship feels like. And I'll give you just one example that, you know, as a former president of PEN International, I mean, you know, the Rohingya disaster and mass murder in Burma is fomented by the generals, but they use a little group of very far right-wing monks to push it. And those monks have driven the campaign on Facebook in Burma. And so that there's a direct link between Facebook and mass murder. Yeah. I mean, it's sorry to be blunt about it. You know, thousands of people die, hundreds of thousands of people are in exile, and this was made largely possible by Facebook. It's a very precise thing. People used to look at anti-Semitic magazines in Germany and the role they played. This was done in an amoral way, which is worse than immorality often, by Facebook in Burma. And so I guess I'm saying this, what do we actually have to do in order to make these systems function in a way that would permit the ideas of citizenship and democracy and so on to strengthen themselves? And I say this, as you know, just the other day, 6 Degrees and ICC started the writing of a public dictionary on all of these subjects, and we were defining in public in the Globe and Mail citizen and multiculturalism and refugee and so on. So we're thinking a lot about this. What has to happen in order for democracy to function in a context like this?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like this is the area where the internet, to some degree, is reflecting the existing society, right? I mean, it's amplifying and augmenting our sort of worst sort of proclivities, but it is reflecting, right? Because one of the first pieces of advice that I got at Wikipedia was from Piero Midjar, who founded eBay. And what he said to me was, he said, you have to obey, and it's like so young, it's so new out there, right? That he was like, a thing you should know is that you have to obey the laws of the country that you're operating in. And I was like, that sounds interesting. What does that actually mean? Like, I don't know, right? And it turns out that it actually means a lot of things, right? Like, if you are operating in Germany, you know, you can't share Nazi material, right? And there are very strong hate speech laws. And there's, if you serve time for a crime, afterwards your record is erased. And that was true for Wikipedia too. People's records had to be erased in the German Wikipedia after they served their time. In Burma, you know, yeah. Facebook, right? And Facebook doesn't have staff in Burma. Facebook doesn't have any expertise, right, in the Burmese culture and history. They could develop it, but I think the argument that I'm making is that the platforms, if they are in the country, they're obeying the laws of the country. In some countries, the laws are designed to protect and support the citizenry, and in some countries, they're not. And
or they're not functioning at all.
Yeah, and Facebook has no position on that, right?
That's the amorality I was talking about.
Yeah, precisely, right? And I mean, what that means in practice is that power is what Facebook orients towards, right? Like, it needs to placate whoever, right? It needs to be acceptable and allowed to continue to do its thing by whoever has the power to stop it from doing its thing. So that will play out differently depending on where you are, right?
This is going to be very difficult. Thank you very much, Sue. Sue Gardner, that was really fantastic. Thank you so much.
Tomorrow we begin our 6 Degrees discussions, which are going to be at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And we're going to bring together all kinds of wonderful people in what we call our citizen space. Thinkers and doers and politicians and civil society leaders. Many of our speakers who have come from all over the world, including Yanis Boutaris, the remarkable mayor of Thessaloniki, Greece, Yasha Monk, who's already been cited, Natan Obed, the president of Inuit Tapparit Kanatami, Canada's national Inuit leader, Ijeoma Alua, who calls herself an internet yeller, John A. Powell, who runs the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley, Rosanna Deerchild, the storyteller and host of Unreserved on CBC, and Giussi Nicolini, who was the mayor of Lampedusa, the island in the Mediterranean, from 2012 to 2017, during the time when she bravely tackled one of the most dramatic crises to have affected the Mediterranean, the arrival of thousands of migrants by ship fleeing conflict and poverty. That's just a little bit. It's going to be a big kitchen table conversation where everyone is exchanging ideas and everyone can get to experience our wonderful, not patented yet, microphone in a cube, which we can throw from person to person. We're going to have our exchanges and 360 sessions. You'll have to divide yourself into 3 or 4 to take place, to be able to go to all of them, but you'll have fun. And tomorrow night, we will move to the Great Hall for 6 Degrees Presents. And on Wednesday evening, I'll be back on this stage happily to present Adrienne Clarkson's prize for global citizenship to my dear friend, Margaret Atwood. And everyone here tonight is invited to join us. We really want you to be part of this ongoing conversation. We'll be working on the dictionary for the next 2 days as well. And so we want to have your definitions, and we want to have you contribute to the diversity of what we are, of our language, of how we are creating it all the time, and how we as people can seize our individuality, be part of a group of people who understand and believe in the principles that have made this country what it is, that has made it the welcoming place that it is, and which, with our efforts, will continue to be the place that we know, love, and can welcome other people to. Thank you. Please join us. And now, Samba. 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 Samba squad coming.